Baruch Hu, oy oy Boachim Shalom, Malachei Shalom, Malachei Elyon, oy 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 Mi Melech Malachei Melachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shalom, Malachei Shalom, Malachei Elyon, Melech Malchei Melachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shalom, Malachei Shalom, Malachei Elyon, Melech Malchei Melachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Oy oy Baruch Hu,
Good evening. Let me turn that off. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Shalom Aleichem, the fast version. That's the melody actually that we use at our Shabbos table. That was sung by the Moshav band with that beautiful Middle Eastern, Mediterranean flair. How are you? It's great to be with you. Let's do some beautiful learning on a Wednesday night. Let's light up the darkness. This is the last candle in a box of candles that I got last year. There are 45 candles in the box. We use about one a week. I also had this other box of candles, IKEA candles, that were lying around before we kind of standardized the candle in the wisdom candle. And so just used up our first box of candles. That was pretty cool. Okay, let me see. Before that, I was using Shabbos candles, the kind of candles that we use for Shabbos candles, and then those IKEA candles. And, about 45 weeks ago, I got into the standardized candle. Okay, who's with us today? Paula in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck, James says shalom, Allison in North Carolina, Gwen in Michigan, Nancy in North Carolina, Rebecca in LA, Belle says shalom y'all, Darcy says shalom, I am Darcy. That's a new name. Welcome, Darcy Bodnar. It's great to have you with us. Darcy from New Jersey. Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Christo in Lubbock, Texas, and this is one of my favorite versions of Shalom Aleichem. He says, Bill, with us from Baking Hot, Kingman, Arizona. I was also here yesterday, but I was still driving at the time. Bill Lilly, Lincoln Park, Michigan. Allison says, how was the ball game last night? My son and I went to see the reopening day at Dodgers Stadium. It was the first time at full capacity. It had been 20% capacity. The crowd was so excited. It was a terrific game. We had nice seats. And it always helps when the home team wins. The Dodgers took it to the Phillies. I'm sorry if you're from Philadelphia, but we're Dodgers fans here. Go Blue. But really, it was just great to be at a stadium with so many people. It was just a great, great joy in the air, and it was a beautiful thing to share with my son. So thank you for asking. Bill in Lincoln Park, John in Sedona, 108 degrees. Wow, I won't complain about hot in Southern California. It's not like that. Carrie in Santa Clarita, Belle says, I like the ululations, and I like spelling them as well. It is fun to use that word, ululation. But that's a terrible ululation. Where am I? Sharon, I learned that melody from Debbie Friedman. Bill, the Wisdom Candle Standard TM. Right? That's our wisdom candle. I just kind of created it in Spark from Adobe at some point a few years ago, and that's definitely become the standard logo of Accidental Talmudist. Paul in Minneapolis, Robert in Hewitt, New Jersey, Leslie in Plano, Texas. Welcome everybody. Over on the YouTube side, Jennifer in Ocala, Marjorie in Georgia, Kevin with a smiley face, and Gigi from British Columbia. Welcome everybody. So I'm going to be, on today's daf, we're on page 66, right? Samech Vav. We're on page 66. We're going to be talking about the second Mishna here in chapter 6 in volume 6 of the Talmud. This is tractate Yoma, the laws of Yom Kippur. We're in chapter 6, and we'll be discussing the second Mishnah today. We're going to make reference to Rabbi Eliezer, and I very often am referring to this story that we won't get to until tractate Bava Metzia on page 59, A and B. It's a long and dramatic story in the Talmud. It's really one of the greatest stories in the Talmud. I mean, Bava Metzia, yeah, it could take another 3 or 4 years until we get to that story. Probably about 3 years. It'll be about a little past the halfway point, I believe, in our 7.5-year journey through the Talmud. But since it sort of comes up very often, I thought I would just tell it. I didn't like look it up, read it, and get ready to tell it to you. So I'm just working from memory here. But it's such a dramatic story. And basically what happened, the incident is called the Oven of Achnai. And so there was an oven, it was like a new technology that came up during the period of the sages, right? So these are the late Second Temple period. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Gamliel, they were there. They were Rabbi Eliezer was a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was sort of the leading sage at the time that the Second Temple was destroyed. He kind of bargained with the Roman general in charge of sacking Jerusalem and destroying the temple, that at least let me take the sages away from Jerusalem and establish our center of Torah learning. It can't be here in Jerusalem anymore. Let it be somewhere else. And so they established Yavne, the community of Yavne. Rabbi Eliezer was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's leading student. Rabbi Eliezer would become the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. I mean, he's just one of the greatest of all sages. And his learning, like everything that he learned, remained with him. His teacher likened him to a basin with plastered walls, and all the knowledge that goes into him is never lost, right? He had everything that he learned, he had perfect recall of it. And his reasoning was incredibly deep and profound and sound as well. He married Ima Shalom, who is a very wise woman and a learned woman in her own right. And she was the sister of the Nasi, Rabban Gamliel, who would become the head of this, who was the head of the Sanhedrin in that period. So Rabbi Eliezer was somebody to be reckoned with. And then this new technology came up, and it was an oven, a clay oven. All ovens were clay ovens at that time. The problem with these clay ovens was that any clay vessel, an earthenware vessel, if it becomes tameh, ritually impure, by virtue of the fact, for example, that a sheretz falls into it, a certain kind of creeping thing that brings impurity, so then you can't purify it. You can't purify an earthenware vessel the way you could with a glass vessel or a metal vessel or even a wooden vessel. The earthenware vessel, there's no remedy for it except to destroy it and make another one or buy another one. And that was a hardship for the poor people. So then they invented this new oven, that it was a clay oven, but rather than be made out of like one big clay piece, and clay ovens, you can sort of imagine them. They're a little bit like you know, well, at any rate, like a pizza oven, kind of like a dome with an opening, a hole in the top to vent some of the smoke, but to really contain the heat inside. But if the sheretz got in, if the creeping thing got in and rendered impure, then they would have to destroy it and get another one. Then they invented this new clay oven that wasn't made as a one-piece clay oven like it had been up until then, but rather was made out of clay rings held together with some kind of a binder, like sand and some kind of a mixture between the clay rings. And so so the concept was, it's not an earthenware vessel. It's an oven with an inside and an outside, but it's made out of separate clay rings. Therefore, it won't become impure according to the same laws as other ovens had in the past. And Rabbi Eliezer said, yes, you're right, this works. This is a kosher oven that will not become impure. If the sheretz gets in, you take it out. But it's not going to be subject to the same laws. The rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer. They said, yeah, but it's still made out of these clay rings, and it has to have the same laws. We're not going to say this is a kosher oven because there's going to be confusion, and people will think, oh, okay, now we've said that clay ovens don't become impure, and a regular clay oven will become impure, and they won't destroy it. It's going to cause too much confusion, and we're going to overrule you, Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, I'm sure that I'm right. And if the law is with me, then let the trees of that, stand of trees over there prove it. In other words, he called for a miracle, and a miracle was performed. The trees moved. Not like the Ents in Lord of the Rings, but regular trees sort of got up and moved. And it's like a miracle, a clear miracle was performed on behalf of Rabbi Eliezer. And in the study hall, the rabbis who disagreed with him said, yeah, we don't listen to miracles. The principle is that the sages of a generation, when a new question comes up, they get together, they discuss it, they vote, and we follow the majority, not miracles. And he said, but heaven will attest that the law is correct. I've got the law correct. You guys might be in the majority, but you're wrong. And it's going to cause a hardship to the people, but that doesn't even matter. The point is that you've got the law wrong. I've got it right, says Rabbi Eliezer. And if indeed I am right, let the water in the river outside the study hall flow backwards. And the water flowed backwards. And then there was a series of miracles like this. Each time a miracle was performed on behalf of Rabbi Eliezer, and the other rabbis said, we don't listen to miracles. Finally, he said, let heaven itself declare, meaning let God speak in our discussion. And a bas kol, a daughter of a voice, and what this is a term that means a heavenly voice. They heard a heavenly voice. They don't call it the voice of God, but essentially it's a voice message sent by God via a messenger, but instead of an angel appearing, it's sort of like an angel just in the form, it's like an audio angel, right? So it's a voice from heaven that says, the law is according to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer's got it right. And the other sages said, we don't listen to voices from heaven. You gave us a principle, God, in the Torah, that in every generation, there's going to be questions that come up. We have an oral tradition. We have a method, a procedure for dealing with new questions. We discuss it among ourselves, and then the leading sages of the generation vote. And we took a vote, and it was everybody against Rabbi Eliezer. Now it's everybody against Rabbi Eliezer and a heavenly voice. You're still outvoted. And they didn't listen to him. Rabbi Eliezer became so frustrated that he said, let the walls of the study hall cave in on us. We should all be dead if this is the kind of arguing that we're going to do in the face of a miracle from heaven. And they said, and then I guess it was Rabban Gamliel who stood up against him, his brother-in-law, and said, no, this is your procedure that you gave us. Do not let the walls come in on us. And out of respect to Rabbi Eliezer, the walls came in a little and stayed there. And out of respect to Rabban Gamliel, they stopped falling in. And the walls and the roof of the study hall held. A little bit indented, but they held. So it was not a good day for Rabbi Eliezer. It was a good day for the procedures of the oral tradition. Because the fact of the matter is, maybe in the very early days of the sages, miracles would actually happen to prove whether one was right or wrong. That didn't happen very often. It seems to have happened that day. But lots of halakhic questions, lots of legal questions come up in every generation, new situations, new technologies, new historical realities, leading to new questions of how are we going to live, how do we perform God's will. And in all those situations, there needs to be a reliable, dependable procedure. The sages discuss, and then they vote, and we follow the majority. That's how it works. And you can't rely on miracles. The sages were right about that. But Rabbi Eliezer was, he just he wouldn't accept that answer. And he basically was saying the sages are wrong. And that was very bad for the standing of the sages, of the rabbis, among the community of Israel. He couldn't accept that he knew he was right, but he couldn't accept that the majority outvoted him. It became a schism between him and them, and his brother-in-law, his wife's brother, Rabban Gamliel, excommunicated him. Right. So the great and saintly Rabbi Eliezer was excommunicated, and none of the sages would come and learn and teach with and learn from him. It was terrible for him. And it was like all he ever wanted to do was to learn and teach Torah, and he was the greatest teacher of the generation, Rabbi Akiva's teacher. But he was excommunicated. They could no longer learn from him. Eventually, his anger about this, he became very bitter. In that story, it's possible that sort of his anger toward Rabban Gamliel ultimately acted like a curse that brought down Rabban Gamliel. The whole thing was a disaster and a schism among the sages, but a very dramatic story. And there's a coda to the story that one of the sages once ran into Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, and said, when this argument was happening in the study hall between Rabbi Eliezer and the sages, what was God's opinion about it? What was the Heavenly Academy's opinion about, what were they saying in heaven about what was going on down below? And Elijah reported that God was sort of pleased. He said, my children have defeated me. Meaning that God God sent an answer with the heavenly voice and said, no, the law is according to Rabbi Eliezer. But God also said, but you know what? They're right. They need to have a reliable, dependable way to judge the law in every generation without relying on miracles. That's how I set it up in the Torah, and they are indeed right. So my children have defeated me in a good way. Right? It's like a dad wants to eventually lose an arm wrestling with his son because his son grew up and is bigger and stronger than his dad. That's what we all want from our children. And God felt the same way. All right, that's Rabbi Eliezer from the Oven of Achnai story. And as we can see, he's incredibly respected as a legal and Talmudic and reasoning mind. He eventually had that conflict, but, like in that story, they give him his due, right? Everyone agrees that he was right according to all the miraculous signs. It's just they didn't agree with him and they weren't going to bend on it. They had their own reasons for saying no. But so we have a kind of troubled attitude toward Rabbi Eliezer among the sages, and that's going to come into play in our story today, in our page of Talmud today. So let's get into it. Okay, the second Mishnah here in chapter 6 on page 66. The Yom Kippur service continues. The high priest comes over to the scapegoat, places both his hands upon it, and confesses. So we're tracing the avodah, the divine service of the high priest on Yom Kippur when the temple was standing or when the tabernacle was standing. And we've been following through everything that he does this day. Now we're talking about the scapegoat. So now he's going to recite the confession over the scapegoat. He did a confession over the other goat, its partner. That's going to be a sin offering. It gets slaughtered in the temple, and then its blood is sprinkled in the Holy of Holies. Now he comes out, and now he's going to deal with the scapegoat. He's going to confess over the scapegoat as well, but that goat is going to be sent out to Azazel, sent out to the wilderness. So he confesses, and he would say as follows, right? Now he's got his hands on it. This is called smicha. He puts his hands on the goat, and he confesses on behalf of the nation, the high priest on Yom Kippur, when the temple is standing or the tabernacle, puts his hands on the scapegoat's head and confesses on behalf of the nation. And he would say as follows: Please God, your people, the house of Israel, have sinned and done wrong and rebelled before you. Please God, grant atonement, please, for the sins and for the wrongs and for the rebellions that they have sinned and done wrong and rebelled before you. Your people, the house of Israel, as it is written in the Torah of Moses your servant, saying, for on this is Leviticus 16:30, for on this day atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you of all your sins. Before the Lord you shall be purified. Now note that the confession is necessary. It could have been, the law says, okay, you do these things, you sprinkle, you send the scapegoat, you do this, you do that, and then atonement is made for you. You are cleansed of your sins, and before the Lord you shall be purified. But note that the confession is necessary, right? That's a necessary part. And it's obviously good to remember when we're making an atonement between humans. We're going to make an apology for something that we've done, a way that we've wronged someone. Okay, well, we have to be willing to state the wrong in a way that the person who was wronged will say, yeah, that's what you did, right? So you've got to make that confession. And the priests and the people standing in the temple courtyard, when they would hear the explicit name emerging from the mouth of the high priest, right? So the only time that the name of God, the ineffable name of God, was actually spoken aloud was in the temple on Yom Kippur. Some say this was the four-letter name of God, that I won't even spell it properly. I'll sort of mispronounce the names of the letters on purpose, and we say Yud K Vav K to refer to the four-letter name of God. But some say it was a special 42-letter name of God, but it was a name that was only heard on Yom Kippur in the temple. And when the people who were present, Israelites who could come in as far as the Israelite courtyard and also surrounding the temple, they're up on the Temple Mount. And when they would hear the priest say that name, what would they do? They would kneel and prostrate themselves and fall on their faces and say, blessed is the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso Olam Va'ed. After the confession over the scapegoat, the priest, the high priest, passed the goat to the person who was to lead it to the wilderness. According to the halacha, the law, everyone is eligible to lead it. You don't have to be a priest in order to lead the goat out into the wilderness, but the high priests, right? So over time, there's only one Kohen Gadol at a time, only one high priest at a time. But over time, the succession of high priests established a fixed custom and did not allow an Israelite to lead the scapegoat out into the wilderness. They gave that job to a priest, not a high priest. The high priest remains there in the temple. He's got a lot to do, but to an ordinary priest. One of his brethren is tasked with taking the goat out to the wilderness and to sacrifice it there, though not by slaughtering with a knife as they do with offerings in the temple, but to sacrifice it in a different manner. Rabbi Eliezer said that was not always the case. There was an incident where a person named R led the goat to the wilderness, and he was not a priest. He was an Israelite, a regular Jew. And they made a ramp for the goat due to the Babylonian Jews who were in Jerusalem, right? Jews from the Babylonian community who went up to Israel, to the Holy Land, and to Jerusalem to be there for Yom Kippur. And apparently they misbehaved, these foreign Jews, the ones from the Babylonian community, when they were in Jerusalem. What would they do? They would pluck the goat's hair and they would say to the goat, take our sins and go, take our sins and go, and do not leave them here with us. They would sort of hurry the goat along, but because it was a big crowd, like a mob, they didn't want the goat to actually interact or possibly be hurt or interfered with by the crowd. So they built a ramp, meaning like an elevated roadway above the crowd to get it out to the wilderness without interacting with the crowd. That's the Mishnah, the Gemara. In the confession over the scapegoat, the high priest confessed the sins of the Jewish people, whereas he did not say the children of Aaron. Now, we've seen that in the earlier parts of the service in the temple, he would bring a bull sacrifice as an atonement for himself, his family, and his fellow priests, and the goat, sin offering on behalf of the nation. But here, with respect to the scapegoat, he only confesses what sins over the scapegoat of the nation. And he doesn't specifically say, and the scapegoat should carry the sins of myself, my family, and all the other priests out to the wilderness. And so the Gemara asks, why not? Why doesn't he mention himself and his family and the other priests, the children of Aaron, your sacred people, in order to confess the sins of the priests? And the Gemara asks, who is the Tana? Who is the rabbi of the Mishnah that taught this? And Rabbi Yirmiyah said, the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. For if it were in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, didn't Rabbi Yehuda say, the priests receive atonement through the scapegoat, which indicates that their sins must be mentioned in the confession of the scapegoat. So it appears that Rabbi Yehuda said, no, the high priest should mention that he's a specific confession for himself, his family, and the other priests, or at least for the other priests, in addition to generally saying the sins of the nation will sort of get carried out to the wilderness with the scapegoat. Abaye said, even if you say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the scapegoat atones for the sins of the priests, is that to say that the priests are not included among your people, the house of Israel? The priests are Jews. They're part of the house of Israel. Nothing can be proven from the fact that the high priest did not list every segment of the Jewish people separately. They receive an atonement along with everyone else, and he doesn't need to mention them separately, according to Abaye. It was taught in the Mishnah that the priest passed the goat to the one who was to lead it into the wilderness. And the sages taught with regard to the verse, and he shall send it away with an appointed man into the wilderness. Leviticus 16:21. Let's read that again because it's very specific. And he shall send it away with an appointed man into the wilderness. And there's a halachic midrash, so rabbinic teaching about law, halacha, which interprets the word man as mentioned in this verse in order to qualify a non-priest for the task. Although the atonement of the people is almost always done, all steps of the process by priests, the fact that this verse in the Torah says an appointed man, it doesn't say priest, it seems that it qualifies a regular Israelite. It doesn't need to be a priest. Therefore, they had a tradition to always send the goat out into the wilderness escorted by a priest. But if a regular Jew did it, it would not disqualify the scapegoat service. That's what we learn from the fact that it says man. The word appointed, it says the appointed man. From the fact that it says man and not priest, we learn that a regular Jew could do it. From the fact that there's this descriptive word appointed, this indicates that he should be designated the day before. He needs to be appointed and not appointed on Yom Kippur. He needs to be chosen before Yom Kippur, at least the day before. The word appointed also indicates that the scapegoat is always sent away at the appointed time. It's sent away on Yom Kippur. Why wouldn't it be sent away on Yom Kippur? Perhaps because Yom Kippur sometimes falls on Shabbos. So maybe if it falls on Shabbos, it would be a problem that they escort the goat out into the wilderness. Similarly, the word appointed indicates that the scapegoat is always sent away at the appointed time, and even when the appointed man is in a state of ritual impurity. Right? So in its appointed time means even if it's on Shabbos, and even if the one who is designated to escort the goat is himself ritually impure. Let's say he came into contact with a corpse or a sheretz, a creeping thing. He's tameh. Nevertheless, he's going to take that goat out into the wilderness on Yom Kippur. The Baraisa stated that the word man is mentioned to qualify a non-priest, and the Gemara expresses surprise. It is obvious that a non-priest is qualified for this service. Why would one have thought otherwise? And the Gemara answers, lest you say the term atonement is written with regard to it. Right? The verse was, and he shall send it away with an appointed man into the wilderness to make an atonement. And since he's making an atonement, you might think that this has to be done by a priest. Therefore, it teaches us that this atonement is not achieved through a sacrificial offering, which requires a priest. Rather, it's going to be taken out and killed. It's going to be offered to God, but not as a sacrificial offering. It's a different kind of offering. And therefore, it can be taken out there by a regular man. It does not have to be a priest. The Baraisa stated that the word appointed indicates that the service is performed even on Shabbos. And the Gemara asks, with regard to what law is this stated? There is no apparent desecration of Shabbos by escorting the goat, since the halacha, the law of the Shabbos boundaries, is merely rabbinic. Right, so you might say, well, if he has to walk further than the Techum, which we learned, right, in Tractate Eruvin, right, that there's a limit to how far you can walk on Shabbos or on a holiday like Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or festivals, there's a limit. You can only walk 2,000 cubits from the place where you establish your dwelling for that Shabbos or that Yom Tov, that holiday. If the place out in the wilderness is further than that, you might think, oh, that he can't do that if it's Shabbos. But that's only a rabbinic law, and we don't apply rabbinic laws to matters that are stated in the Torah and that are carried out by the priests on behalf of the nation. Where some rabbinic decrees do, but here we could say, well, this is a rabbinic decree, we can override that. So is that the reason? Because he's going to walk too far? And the Gemara says, no. Rav Sheshet said, it has nothing to do with the Shabbos boundary. That's not the issue. It is mentioned that we're going to do it in its appointed time, even if it happens on Shabbos, in order to state that if the goat were ill and he could not walk the whole way, that the one who escorts the goat carries it and on his shoulder. He's going to have to carry the goat. Like if the goat becomes ill and it can't walk, then the one who's just supposed to escort the goat is actually going to pick up the goat and carry it. Now you can't do that on Shabbos, carry something in the public domain, but it has to be done on that day in its appointed time. So if the goat can't walk, that man will pick up the goat and carry it. Then the Gemara will ask, well, wait a minute, why are we even making this distinction? Aren't the laws of carrying, for example, the same on Yom Kippur as they are on Shabbos? And the answer is yes, they are. You didn't even need to make this distinction, but the fact remains, whether it's Shabbos or not, on Yom Kippur, that goat goes out to the wilderness. Apropos this discussion, the Gemara mentions, okay, so it comes up, apropos this discussion, the Gemara mentions, right, if the goat became ill, right, or if the man became ill. These questions are going to come up. Hold on a second. Yeah, right. So we said also that the law states that if the man who's escorting the goat, if he became ritually impure, if he became tameh, he still does it because it has to be done in its appointed time. So apropos this teaching, the Gemara mentions that the students once asked Rabbi Eliezer from the Oven of Achnai story, if the goat became ill, what is the law with regard to whether the escort may carry it on his shoulder? Now we know he can carry it. We have that ruling. But when the students asked Rabbi Eliezer, can it be carried? This is Rabbi Eliezer who knows everything, right? So they asked him, can the escort carry it on his shoulder? He said to them, that goat can carry me and you. Meaning the goat designated healthy was unlikely to become ill. Rabbi Eliezer thereby avoided the question. They asked him, if the one sending the goat away became ill, what is the law with regard to whether they send it with someone else? If he became ill, can we appoint somebody else on Yom Kippur? Since we appointed him yesterday, then he became ill. Now he can't do it. So can we appoint a new guy on Yom Kippur so that the goat goes out at the right time? He said to them dismissively, I and you shall be in peace. In other words, this would never happen, that the one who's appointed would be ill on Yom Kippur. But of course it could happen. Why is he dismissing their questions? The students continued to question Rabbi Eliezer. If he pushed the goat, right? So the way that the goat is killed out in the wilderness, it's very painful to the modern ear. It's taken to a cliff. That goat is going to die on this day, right? One goat is slaughtered in the temple. It's slaughtered with a very quick cut, like a kosher butcher would do, across its jugular. Blood comes out, the lifeblood. The goat dies quickly. The lifeblood is collected. That gets sprinkled inside the temple. The scapegoat that is sent to the wilderness is taken to the edge of a very, very, very high cliff, and it is thrown over the cliff, and it falls to its death. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. That is the way that the scapegoat was killed in the wilderness, as the Torah commands, right? So what if it was pushed over the cliff, but it didn't die? They asked Rabbi Eliezer. What is the law with regard to whether he should walk down to the base of the cliff and then kill it to make sure it's dead? And he said to them, from Judges 5:31, so may all your enemies perish, Lord. Right, in a battle, I think from the book of Judges, I don't even remember what battle that was, but the Jews defeated their enemy, and then the prophet or the judge, the leader, said, and so may all your enemies perish. So in other words, the goat will certainly die on its own. Like, you don't have to worry that it won't die if it falls off the cliff. But what if it didn't die? And he's not answering their question. He's like, no, so may all your enemies perish. It will perish. Rabbi Eliezer did not wish to answer these questions, as will be explained below. However, the sages say, so Eliezer wouldn't answer the question, but they're valid questions. And so the sages give the answers to these questions. If the goat became ill, the escort carries it on his shoulder. If the one sending out the goat became ill, he sends the goat with someone else. If he pushes it over the cliff and it does not die, he follows it down and kills it. So, of course, they're valid questions, and the sages gave the answers to these questions. And Rabbi Eliezer surely knew the answers to these questions. Why did he sort of evade the questions by giving kind of ambiguous, non-responsive answers? The Gemara cites more questions that the students asked Rabbi Eliezer and which he refused to answer. They asked Rabbi Eliezer, what is the fate of so-and-so, a certain man who was known to be wicked with regard to the world to come? He evaded the question and said to them, you have only asked me about so-and-so and not a different individual whom you believe to be righteous, right? So they said, there's this public person, prominent person who's done wicked things. Does he have a place in the world to come? He said, well, why don't you ask about a righteous person and whether they have a place in the world to come? Again, he didn't answer their question. He's also avoiding Lashon Hara, speaking, gossip, slander, just speaking anything about other people. You shouldn't do it. They asked him, what is the law with regard to whether a shepherd may save a ewe, right, a female sheep, from a lion on Shabbos? May a shepherd save a female sheep from a lion on Shabbos? He said to them, you have only asked me about the ewe? You're only asking me about this female sheep? And that's all he said. They asked him, well, what is the law with regard to saving the shepherd from a lion on Shabbos? Now, obviously, you can do that. You can violate Shabbos any way necessary in order to save a life. But he doesn't answer them. He said to them, you have only asked me about the shepherd. You have only asked me about the shepherd? They asked him, they're like, why is he being so mysterious? What is it that he wants from us? So they keep asking questions. What is the law with regard to whether a mamzer inherits from his parents? A mamzer is a tragic situation. Sort of a classic situation that somebody could be a mamzer is that his mother cheated on his father with another man. She committed adultery, got pregnant, and this is, the offspring of that union. This is a very, very difficult, very painful situation. The kid did nothing wrong, but he can't marry into the community. Now the question is, well, okay, but can he inherit the property of his parents? Rabbi Eliezer responded with a question. Did you not ask me what is the law with regard to whether he may perform levirate marriage? Levirate marriage means he has a brother who is older than him, let's say, and who was married, and then he died before he had a child. May his wife, that man's wife, now perform levirate marriage with the mamzer brother? And actually, she can. So this is like an escape clause for the situation of the mamzer. But at any rate, he changed the subject. And they asked him, what is the law with regard to whether it is permitted to plaster one's house after the destruction of the temple? The answer of that is, when we build a house after the destruction of the temple, for the last 2,000 years, when a Jew builds a house, he leaves it unfinished. Some part of his house doesn't get painted or doesn't get plastered, and you sort of leave one conspicuous place, often like on the wall near the front door, you leave it unpainted. You don't finish the house, and that is symbolic of our mourning, our distress that never goes away, because we can only study these laws. We can't fulfill them when the temple is not in our midst. It's a sign of mourning. So they asked him about that. How does he feel about that? And Rabbi Eliezer said, what is the law with regard to plastering one's grave? It's like just a mysterious answering a question with a mysterious question. Now, the Gemara finally explains, why didn't he answer their questions? Why did he ask these weird questions in return as a way of evading them and not giving them an answer? And the Gemara explains, it was not because he was distancing them with words, right? And made irrelevant statements because he did not know the answers to these questions. Rather, Rabbi Eliezer responded in this way because he never said anything that he did not hear from the mouth of his teacher, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, that doesn't mean that he never engaged in legal disputes and gave his own analysis. But when he was asked to give a ruling, a halachic ruling, he would only give a ruling on a matter of law that he heard directly from his teacher so that he would know that it was true and correct. This is actually a tremendous lesson in judging others favorably. People might have heard him avoiding answering those students' questions and said, this guy's an idiot. This guy's I heard he was a great rabbi, a great teacher. He doesn't know the answers to some simple questions. It must be that he's not so great. Maybe he forgot his learning. Maybe he never learned so much in the first place, right? But he, for whatever reason, he didn't just say to them, I don't answer questions on halachic matters unless I heard the answer directly from my teacher. Rather, he gave these kind of mysterious questions in return. Now, there's a note about that. Many commentaries, Si Maharsha and Siach Yitzhak, explain that Rabbi Eliezer did answer the questions put to him. It was just he did so indirectly. His answer to the question of whether the goat could be carried on the escort's shoulder may be rendered, you and I may carry him, i.e. the messenger who is healthy is prohibited to carry a person or an animal that cannot walk on its own, but if two people carry together, neither is doing the full-fledged transgression of carrying on the festival, and so that might be a way to handle it. It is prohibited to carry. Right. Similarly, when they asked about the case where the escort becomes ill and he answered, I and you shall be in peace, he thereby indicated that a new escort should be appointed from me or you. And when they asked whether the man should follow the goat down to kill it, and he answered, so may all your enemies perish, Lord, he thereby indicated that once the goat was pushed over the cliff, it was not necessary to do anything else. He disagreed with the other sages on that, and this was a way to avoid disagreeing with all the other sages. Now, we're not sure when he was avoiding this. I mean, it can't be after he was excommunicated, because his students wouldn't be asking questions after he was excommunicated. But we see that he had, right, this kind of troubled relationship because he was so brilliant, he was so knowledgeable, he knew so much that, he maybe what he was really doing was cutting off a discussion that was going to lead to, once again, where he's in the minority, everyone else is ruling a different way, he's sure he's right, and he wants to just avoid the whole thing. Maybe that's what's going on. But now we come to a really difficult part. The Gemara cites another question that was posed to Rabbi Eliezer. A wise woman asked Rabbi Eliezer, since all bore equal responsibility for the incident of the golden calf, due to what factor were their deaths not equal? Now, here what's saying is, in the incident of the golden calf, while Moses was up on Mount Sinai receiving the Torah, and he was a little late coming down, the people freaked out, and many of them panicked and said to Aaron, build us a golden calf. We demand it, right? Or they were going to kill him. They already killed somebody else who wouldn't comply with their demands. Aaron was afraid they'd kill him. He said he collected their earrings of the men and their jewelry, threw it in the fire, and a calf came out. And then they danced around the calf. When Moses came down, he was furious. He smashed the first tablets of the 10 Commandments. He called the Levites to his side because none of the Levites participated in that. And then they went through and ended that carousing around the idol of the golden calf. And many were slain by the sword on that day. God was furious, and then the ones that weren't slain by the sword, but who participated in the sin of the golden calf, a plague was unleashed upon them. And then ones who weren't killed by the sword or by this plague were killed by this painful intestinal disease called hydrocon. So there were 3 manners of dying for people who participated in the sin of the golden calf. Most of the population didn't. It was sort of like the rabble-rousers who did. But there were 3 different modes of capital punishment, 3 modes of dying, some by the sword, some by the plague, and some by this intestinal disease. And so this wise woman says to Rabbi Eliezer, well, all these people participated in the sin of the golden calf. Why were there 3 different modes of capital punishment administered to them? What was the difference between them? What does Rabbi Eliezer say to her? Just as he didn't answer his students' questions, he just asked some different question in return, he doesn't answer her question. And he says to her, there is no wisdom in a woman except weaving with a spindle. And so it states, Exodus 35:25, and any woman who was wise-hearted spun with her hands. Therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, in this statement that he's making at this moment, it is unbefitting for a woman to concern herself with such questions. Now, that's something we really object to with a modern ear. Now, were the sages okay with this? Apparently not. With regard to this issue, it was stated that the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara, Rav and Levi, disagreed. One of them said, one who sacrificed and burned incense to the calf, which are idolatrous practices that incur capital punishment, they were punished by the sword. The ones who embraced and kissed the idol, which are actually not forms of idolatrous worship that incur capital punishment, they were subject to the divine punishment of death by a plague. And the ones who didn't, even hug or kiss the idol, but who rejoiced inwardly that there was this idol among them, but performed no overt act, they were killed by intestinal illness known as hydrocon. So we're not sure which one said that, Rav or Levi, but one of them's had that view. And the other one said, the ones who served the calf in the presence of witnesses and received a warning that you shouldn't do that, they were punished by the sword. The ones who served the calf in the presence of witnesses, but without a warning, were subject to death by a plague. And the ones who served without witnesses and without warning were killed by hydrocon, that intestinal disease. And Rav Yehuda adds, the entire tribe of Levi did not engage in idol worship, as it is stated. Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, who is for God? Let him come to me. And all the children of Levi gathered to him. Ravina sat and related this law with regard to the tribe of Levi. Now, before we continue, the point is, this wise woman who asked Rabbi Eliezer the question, she's not described here in our Gemara as that woman or the woman. The rabbis of the Gemara who record this incident describe her as the wise woman who posed a question. And the question that she asked was an excellent question, and it was debated by the sages, by Rav and Levi. So, what was going on with Rabbi Eliezer? It sounds like he was rude to her and says there's no wisdom in a woman except the craft that she does with her hands, as described in the Torah, that it was the wise-hearted women who created the tabernacle, right? Who created so much of the tabernacle in the wilderness. It was woven by wise-hearted women. Now, maybe Rabbi Eliezer was sort of giving a compliment that women have a different kind of wisdom, not just for weaving, but for many practical matters. But maybe they should stay away from, Torah reasoning and Talmudic discussion. But the sages don't agree with him, right? They're saying, well, no, she asked a good question. Now, there definitely are views in the Talmud that you don't teach Talmud to women, right? Obviously, that is not a universal view, and that's why we're doing this right here. However, Rabbi Eliezer had that view, and what's interesting about it is that this view of Rabbi Eliezer's, right, is listed among a bunch of questions that he refused to answer. Now, we can give him the benefit of the doubt that he didn't want to answer those questions because he couldn't give a legal answer according to views that he learned directly from his teacher, and he didn't want to get involved in those discussions. But maybe what we have here is that the rabbis were being a little bit critical of Rabbi Eliezer, particularly in light of the fact that he was so convinced that he was right that he got into that terrible dispute against his brother-in-law, and it almost caused the whole rabbinic edifice to crumble and go its separate ways. And, they had to excommunicate him and ostracize him. And he's sort of like the hero/victim of that story. But as we see, the later sages maybe have a more nuanced, and complex view of Rabbi Eliezer. And this incident with the wise woman and the sharp answer that he gave her is not being held up as a model of how you should answer women who have wise questions at all. It's just how Rabbi Eliezer dealt with it, and Rabbi Eliezer came to a bad and painful end, as we learn in that other story, or at least a painful end. Ravina sat and related this law with regard to the tribe of Levi. And the sons of Rav Papa bar Abba raised an objection to Ravina, right? Somebody said, right, so we'll go on now that we're talking about the sons of Levi, that they didn't participate in the sin of the golden calf. Rav Yehuda said, yeah, the Levites didn't participate in it at all. Ravina cited this law of Rav Yehuda, that the Levites didn't participate in it at all. But the sons of Rav Papa bar Abba raised an objection to Ravina. The verse states at Deuteronomy 33:9, the verse states in praise of the tribe of Levi and the final blessings that Moses gives to the Jewish people right before his death. So he blesses the tribe of Levi, and he says about the tribe of Levi, who said of his father and his mother, I have not seen him, neither did he acknowledge his brothers, nor did he know his sons. And this indicates that some of them did engage in idol worship and were killed by their relatives. In other words, when the Levites went through and slaughtered and killed, put to the sword, everyone who participated in the sin of the golden calf, they, did that even to their close relatives. So that would seem to, if somebody was engaged in idol worship, they did not spare them. They killed anyone that they caught, worshiping the idol. So it would seem that, well, then there must have been Levites who were also worshiping, since it says that they did not, spare their father or their mother, and they didn't acknowledge their brothers, and he did not know his sons on that day. He just killed anyone who was engaged in worshiping the golden calf. Ravina answered them, his father does not refer to his actual father, but rather his mother's father, who was an Israelite. Similarly, the term his brothers is referring to his half-brothers from his mother's side, who were fathered by an Israelite, and his sons is referring to his daughter's sons from an Israelite, who are also considered Israelites. In fact, however, no one from the tribe of Levi worshipped the calf, according to Ravina. The Levites did not participate in that sin. And then I'm going to end now and go to your comments and questions. It's just a last little passage there before we get to the third Mishnah, which we'll cover tomorrow, the third Mishnah of chapter 6, which says that with regard to the Babylonian Jews who were in Jerusalem when Yom Kippur was being observed, when the temple was standing and the scapegoat was going out to the wilderness, and they said they needed to build a ramp because the Babylonian Jews would sort of pick at the goat as it went by and try to rush it along and kind of yank its hair and like make it go faster. And it was very, it was a bit of a mob, and they didn't want the goat to interact with that foreign mob. So they built that ramp to go over the crowd. And this final passage says, the Mishna said those were Babylonian Jews, but the Gemara says actually they were not Babylonian Jews, they were Alexandrian Jews, right? There was a big community in Alexandria in Egypt of an established Jewish community during the Roman period. And when those Alexandrian Jews would come up to Jerusalem for Yom Kippur, they were the ones that would kind of act like a mob and try to push that goat along. All right, we end there. Tomorrow we'll continue with the third Mishnah. Let me check comments or questions. I know class is running a little long tonight. Bill says, this actually answers a question I've had for years. That is, if the name was only ever said on Yom Kippur, how did a high priest learn it? But if the high priest is audible from the Holy of Holies all the way to the Israelite court, then that makes perfect sense. Well, he's not in the Holy of Holies, right? When he's doing smicha over the scapegoat, he's out in the courtyard. When he's slaughtering, in fact, all the times that he does the confession over the bull, over the goat that's going to be a sin offering, and over the scapegoat, he's out there in the courtyard and they can hear him. He's not in the Holy of Holies for that, but they can hear him even out beyond the courtyard where the Israelites can stand. Sharon, there's nothing in the Peshat that says that the goat for Azazel is killed at a cliff. Where did that understanding come into being? Correct. So it doesn't say that it's thrown off a cliff. I'm not sure if it says stoned or not, because that... All right, so we'll see. We'll see. Okay, so somehow they derive that it's a Torah requirement that it is sent over the cliff, but we're not there yet, right? So I think the next Mishnah is about the journey of the one who escorts the goat. And by the time we get to the actual cliff, I believe that's when we'll derive the law of why it's a cliff and not some other way. Certainly that is what the tradition became, that they pushed it over the cliff. Where do they derive that that's the correct method? We shall see. And finally, Brandon, as a child, my family and I would watch Yentl, the movie Yentl. Is there a ruling in the Talmud that forbade women from learning Talmud, or was it merely a tradition? Or is the film's depiction of female exclusion entirely fictional and not reflecting actual historical practices? No, women were excluded. There's definitely a bunch of teachings that is inappropriate to teach Talmud to women. Clearly not everybody holds by that. There's a tradition that Rashi's daughters were very well versed. Even in the Talmud, we know that there's certain women, Rabbi Meir's wife is one of them, who were very well versed and knew a whole lot, and their teachings could be relied upon. Like other things, like women are not obligated in time-bound positive commandments, and Torah study is a time-bound positive commandment. You're supposed to do it every day. So women are not obligated in Torah study. And from that, they learn that, well, if they're not obligated, maybe they shouldn't be taught because it's a different, we're not going to get into that tonight. But the point is, there are those rulings and there are opposite rulings, right? And clearly women are learning, but there are restrictions about it. It is not historical fiction. Women were excluded from a lot of things, and it definitely is a patriarchal tradition in a lot of ways. But there were also exceptions, and there were exceptions to this opinion that come up quite a bit. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we will be together again tomorrow night. Have a great night. All the best.